everyone. Thank you for attending this session, which is the first of 4 in this series on the codes that apply to electrified hardware. I'm Lori Greene. I'm the Manager, Codes and Resources for Allegion, and today's topic is access control hardware and the UL 294 and UL 1034 listings that apply to some electrified hardware applications. I'm really excited about this topic because out of all the code questions I receive, this is probably the most common area of the model codes that I'm asked about, and there have been a lot of misinterpretations happening. So we're going to try to cut through some of those today. There have been some code changes that I think are going to help with the understanding of the intent of the code, so we'll cover all of those. So as I said, I'm Lori. You may have visited my website. I hope you have. idighardware.com. That's where I write about door openings and the codes that apply every weekday, pretty much. And I'm going to start with a presentation that covers some of the code requirements, and then I will be answering questions along with my colleagues, Mark Kuhn, who's one of our Allegion specification consultants, and Matt Phillips, who is our compliance engineering manager. We all have kind of different specialties, so hopefully we'll be able to cover all of the questions. So we did receive some questions with the registrations for this session and by email, so I will cover those first. I wanted to have some slides and some images and code excerpts and things to point to. So the most common question is which electrified hardware applications require the listings? And the second most common question is which components of a system require the listings according to the model codes. There were also a bunch of questions about special locking arrangements and normal locking arrangements. So we'll go through all of that and hopefully come out the other end with a better understanding. So before we get started on the main topic, I just want to mention a few general things. First, this session, like all of my code classes and sessions, they all cover the model code requirements. Usually I talk about the most recent editions of the code. Sometimes I go a little bit forward, a little bit backward. And so currently we're on the 2024 editions of the model codes. That's what's available. That might not be what is being used in your area. The 2027 editions will be out shortly. And then the codes for the individual states, cities, other countries may vary, so it's important to refer to the adopted codes to find specific information. For example, if you work in a healthcare facility, you might be saying, well, we still use the 2012 edition of NFPA 101, which is the case for most healthcare facilities. And in that edition, only 2 sections of the special locking arrangements require the UL 294 listing for hardware. So if you have questions about the local codes, we have a team of ACEs, the Allegion code experts. They can help answer them. And to find them, you just go to idighardware.com. There's an orange ball on the right-hand side, and you click on that, and it will connect you, give you your local person in your state who should be able to answer your questions with the local code requirements. The next thing I want to mention is that Matt, Mark, and I all work with the Builders Hardware Manufacturers Association, or BHMA, in code development. And in each code change cycle, we usually have at least a couple dozen code change proposals related to doors. So we really have done a lot of work in clarifying the codes and getting kind of ahead of it rather than waiting to see what the new code requires. We are there helping to make those changes. So we don't make all the changes. Some of the changes that I will talk about today were made by other groups, but we do work in that organization. And the important thing to remember with regard to that is some of the changes are actual changes, and they can't be implemented until a particular code has been adopted in your area, in your jurisdiction. But other changes are clarifications, and for me, those can be used right away for a better understanding of the intent of the code. So we have some of each of those in today's presentation and probably in the Q&A as well. So the biggest misconceptions about UL 294, and it seems like how can a listing be such a cause of pain for me anyway. Partly it's because there were a lot of misconceptions around when and where this listing is required. So it's not required for every single piece of electrified hardware. And not every piece of electrified hardware has the listing, and it's not appropriate for every piece to have the listing. So there are sections in the model codes where the listing is specifically referenced. Those are commonly known as the special locking arrangements. But the most common electrified hardware application is not a special locking arrangement, and the model codes don't require the listings for those systems. So I'm going to talk about this more later and the code changes that were made to help clarify this. So here's an example from the 2021 IBC. I told you I might go back and forward in time. So this is from the International Building Code. This is the 2021 edition. And this section addresses the door hardware release of electrically locked egress doors. So what's that? That's first problem. What kind of hardware are we talking about here? So this type of system typically involves an electromagnetic lock that's released by a switch in the panic hardware, the lock set, or the sensor bar that's mounted on the door. And you'll see here item 6 requires the locking system units to be listed to UL 294. So next question. What is a locking system unit? Is it the lock? Is it the power supply, the reader, the hinge, the electric hinge, the power transfer? I don't know. So I didn't put it in there. So the commentary for the International Building Code uses that same term. So it was really unclear which components of the system require the listing. I've had requests for every different type of situation you can imagine. In the 2024 edition of the International Building Code and the International Fire Code, or the I codes, this language has been updated in all of the sections that previously referenced UL 294. So these sections now specifically mention the locking device. It says the electromechanical or electromagnetic locking device. And then it clarifies that the listings don't apply to every component because it's specifically saying the locks. So that's really helpful in clarifying what the intent of the codes was. There are some systems where the lock, let's say a delayed egress lock, for example, might require a UL 294 listed power supply, but that's part of the hardware listings. It's not a model code listing, but just something to be aware of. The other change that was made in this section was to permit UL 1034 as an alternative to UL 294. So I would consider the first part of this a clarification that helps us to understand more about the intent of what the codes are looking for, whether it's which component, in this case it's the lock. And then I would consider the addition of UL 1034 as an alternative as a change that is not implemented until the 2024 code is adopted in a project's jurisdiction. So just keep that in mind. We've got one clarification, one change. A similar change has been made to NFPA 101, which is the life safety code. Again, this is the section for door hardware release of electrically locked egress door assemblies. Nobody ever said it was easy, but in this section, it's the same, usually a mag lock released by a switch in the door mounted hardware. That's the key. So like the I codes, this section references the electromechanical or electromagnetic locking hardware, but it specifies that this applies to new installations, which is a little bit different from the IBC and the IFC. The 2024 edition of NFPA 101 also permits either UL 294 or UL 1034. And what it previously said was hardware for new installations is listed in accordance with UL 294 access control system units. So we kind of had the same problem, like just says hardware, which hardware? So now this change is helping us understand more about the intent. And then as always in the NFPA codes, if there's an asterisk, that tells us that there's more information in the Annex A. And when I use red italicized text on the slide, that means it's coming straight from the code. So here you can see exactly what the code says. So Matt can get into this in more detail if there are questions because he spends much more time with these standards than I do. But my understanding is that UL 294 looks at the reliability of the entire system, including software and power consumption, while UL 1034 addresses the physical strength of the lock itself. So for some products, it makes more sense to use one standard or the other, which is why the model codes now allow either or. So going back to our 2021 IBC example, we see the locking system units language and the reference to UL 294. And then looking at the same section in the 2024 edition of the IBC, we see the clarification showing that the listing applies to the locks and the change is there that permits UL 1034 in addition or as an alternative to UL 294. There might be other listings that are required. If the door is a swinging fire door assembly, then the components of the assembly are going to be listed to UL 10C as well. If the door is serving an area that requires panic hardware, the hardware is going to have to be listed to UL 305. So there might be some other listings as well. The IBC commentary for this section includes some further information that states that the requirement for the listing does not apply to locks that are part of an access control system, also known as an ingress control system. So that's interesting. What does that mean? So that brings us to our next clarification, which includes both the special locking arrangements and these access control systems that are mentioned here in the commentary, or I like to call them normal locking arrangements. So not everybody has run into that term before, but it works well in conjunction with we have special locking arrangements and we have our normal locking arrangements. So typically the listing requirements apply to special locking arrangements, and those are all listed here. And for many editions of the codes, these systems have had specific code sections that address them. So if you want to look at delayed egress, you can go and find the section on that. Or if you want to look at stairwell reentry, you can go find the section on that. But this list does not include all types of electrified hardware systems, including the most common type of access control system that I mentioned on the previous slide. So I'm going to cover some of these special locking arrangements in future sessions. But just to get us started, I put a few in here to compare. So here we have two that are kind of similar because these two systems are both usually used with electromagnetic locks. So the sensor release section, that's the door on the left, addresses doors where the lock is released by a sensor detecting a building occupant approaching the door. So I'm approaching the door, it senses me, and it unlocks that mag lock for egress. And then we also have to have an auxiliary push button, and the door has to unlock upon power failure and upon fire alarm activation if the building has a fire alarm system. With the door hardware release, that's the one I've been using as an example, it's the one on the right, it's the same type of lock. It's usually a mag lock, but instead of being released by a sensor, the lock is released, like I said, by a switch in the hardware that's mounted on the door. So same lock, different release methods. So with this application, the model codes don't require the auxiliary push button or the fire alarm release. That's news to some people, but the lock has to release for egress upon power failure. So the codes, I always like to say the codes are a minimum. You can use the auxiliary push button. You can use the fire alarm release. It might be required by the local jurisdiction, but it is not required by the model codes. So here we have two that look pretty similar. They are delayed egress on the left and controlled egress on the right. And they look similar, but the function is different and they're addressed in different code sections. So with delayed egress locks, they unlock the door for egress after a 15-second delay, or 30 seconds can be approved by the authority having jurisdiction. So these locks we're usually seeing now in mercantile occupancies like the secondary exits serving a retail space. The doors have to unlock immediately for egress if there's a fire alarm activation or if there's power failure. And then on the right, we have controlled egress locks, which are only permitted in healthcare facilities. I'm seeing people trying to use them in lots of other locations, but no, they are specifically permitted in healthcare facilities in the units where patients require containment for their safety or security. So common applications for those are memory care, maternity, pediatrics, and sometimes we see them in emergency departments. Also behavioral health, although there are some other things that can be done in behavioral health. So these doors they're different from delayed egress, which are going to let you out after 15 seconds. The one on the right, the controlled egress, those doors are going to remain locked until evacuation is needed. And the model codes have a long list of how that has to happen, what has to release those doors for egress. And then here we have two semi-related sections. So the stairwell reentry section addresses the need for building occupants to be able to leave the stairwell and re-enter the building if the stair becomes compromised during a fire. On the right, we have a brand new section, which I will be covering in a future session. And that is when you have an elevator lobby where the path of egress doesn't go directly to a stairwell. It goes through the tenant space usually. I mean, in this application, it would go through the tenant space and to a remote stairwell that's not right next to the elevator lobby. So this is a brand new section in the 2024 IBC. So make sure you tune in for a future session, and I'll talk about those and what the requirements are. There's been a section on that in NFPA 101 for a long time, but not in the I codes. So that's something new to know about. Finally, as we talk about special locking arrangements, I should say, there will be a new section in the 2027 I codes that covers interlocks, or in the code, they're called control vestibules. So this is an application that we commonly see in clean rooms and high security areas. Was not covered by the code before, so there were inconsistencies between jurisdictions and from one AHJ to the next. So the way this works is when one door is opened, the other door cannot be opened until the first door comes to a close. So I will have a future session on this one. And all of these special locking arrangements that I mentioned do require the UL 294 or 1034 listings according to the 2024 codes, except that the I codes don't require the listings for stairway doors in the I code section that covers stairwell reentry. So NFPA 101 does require the listings for stairway doors with electrified locks. Now that's a whole nother topic. We'll talk about that on another day. So back to our list of special locking arrangements. Gone through all these different types of access control doors. We kind of classify them all together. If it's electrified hardware, it's access control. But the most common type of access control door, the most frequently used electrified hardware, is where we have access control and free egress. So there's been a code change that I'm going to talk about. But remember, in each section of the IBC commentary where it talks about UL 294 and UL 1034, it references those access control doors or our normal locking arrangements, and it says that the listing requirements don't apply to those. So what type of system is this? This is the one that you see all the time. This is where you have, you don't have hardware that is going to affect egress like a delayed egress system would or a controlled egress system would. So these are doors where there's usually a reader on the outside to release the hardware for ingress or access, but egress is not affected by the electronics of the system. So the doors meet the same requirement as doors with mechanical locking hardware, like as shown here on the slide. They unlatch with one releasing motion without a key, tool, special knowledge, or effort, with no tight grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist. And then the releasing hardware has to be mounted between 34 and 48 inches above the floor. There are some exceptions to that. So the problem with this type of system, code-related problem, for me, it was no problem because it's right there. The hardware complies with all of the same requirements that mechanical hardware has to comply with, but there was no specific code section to point to. As soon as it had a wire on it, everyone started looking in the special locking arrangements sections to see, okay, which section is going to apply. And there wasn't one. So someone would try to find one or apply delayed egress or apply controlled egress, or it just got really messy. So to give a little bit of background, In the 2021 edition of the iCodes, a section was added that addressed monitored or recorded egress. So that would apply to doors with exit alarms, with a reader on the egress side to shunt the alarm, or doors where the reader on the egress side was used for time and attendance, but was not affecting the egress at all. So this section was added, and you can see the section here. And it says, these doors can either comply with one of the special locking arrangements sections, which are those numbers that you see there, or they have to be readily operable from the egress side without the use of a key or special knowledge or effort. So hopefully that sounds familiar to some of you. If it sounds familiar, it's because this is the requirement for mechanical locking hardware. It has to be readily openable from the egress side. So in the 2024 edition, this section was modified to include doors with access control systems. So instead of just monitored or recorded egress, now we have a section to point to for doors with access control and free egress. So as long as these doors are readily openable from the egress side without the use of a key or special knowledge or effort, the special locking arrangements sections don't apply. And note that there's no reference in this section to the UL 294 or UL 1034 listings for these types of systems. So with that said, codes are a minimum. Might be a specification item. It could be something that's required locally, but that is what the model codes require. So before we get to the Q&A, I just want to leave you with a few resources. idighardware.com has a page on the topics menu. You can see the topics menu there at the bottom. The page is called Special Locking Arrangements, and that page has information about each of the special locking arrangements and then also links to additional articles and videos. I also recently wrote an article about the listings for electrified hardware for my Decoded series, which is in Door Security and Safety magazine. So that might be a good reference, especially if you need to share this information with somebody. I'm going to post these resources and the recordings on the live page of idighardware.com. So you can get there just by going idighardware.com/live. And then finally, some of you may be familiar with the Allegiant Code Reference Guide. I just updated it. So there's a new version at idighardware.com/guide. I'll put that on the live page as well. We do still have the hard copies available, but there's also a digital flip book, or you can download a PDF, and both of those digital versions have links to additional information. So you can scan the QR code, or it's a pretty easy link. You can follow the link, or in the right sidebar of iDig Hardware, I also put the image of the book, and you can just click on it and get to it that way.